In the medieval imagination, the notion of blood was more than biology. It was a sacred inheritance, a mystical thread that bound rulers to the divine order of kingship. To reign without pure blood was to stand accused of usurpation, to risk rebellion, and to invite eternal condemnation. Dynasties therefore elevated their lineages to mythic proportions, claiming descent from gods, saints, or heroes. But this sacred obsession was not benign. It demanded a price, and too often, it was the youngest and most defenseless who paid. Throughout medieval Europe, Byzantium, the Islamic world, and Asia, children of kings and princes were born into palaces gilded with promises of immortality. Yet the moment of birth was also a moment of peril. For queens, mistresses, and concubines alike, the child they bore could decide their fate. If the infant was male and acknowledged, the mother's status rose. But if the child was deemed illegitimate, inconvenient, or threatening to existing heirs, it became a liability to the dynasty. And liability could not be tolerated. Drowning was one of the most whispered methods of removal. It left no scars, no visible wounds. The water carried away both breath and evidence. Chroniclers of Byzantium recorded with muted tones how imperial midwives, acting under orders, placed infants into basins of water, holding them until silence fell. It was a method both cruel and deliberate, an act shrouded in ritual, yet rooted in political necessity. To those who sanctioned it, this was not simple murder. It was purification. The act of drowning held symbolic power. In Christian Europe, baptism by water cleansed the soul. In the logic of ruthless courts, drowning erased the impurity of an unwanted birth. The child's death was framed not as an atrocity, but as an act of protection, preserving dynastic legitimacy from corruption. A child whose bloodline could weaken a throne was not merely an infant, but a contagion, a threat to order, a danger waiting to mature into rebellion. In the twisted arithmetic of royal survival, better to drown one newborn than risk decades of civil war. The cruelty of this reasoning was not confined to one culture. In the Mughal courts of India, children born from concubines who fell from favor were quietly erased from palace life. Some were poisoned, others simply vanished. In China's imperial palaces, strict hierarchies dictated whose children could live to maturity. An infant born out of turn, or against the wishes of the empress, was often smothered before it drew attention. The drowning of royal babies was but one method in a long, chilling list of strategies designed to maintain an unbroken appearance of purity. Behind these acts were women, mothers who bore the unbearable silence of loss. Their grief rarely reached official records, for to mourn was to question the throne. Yet traces of lament survived in whispers, in hidden poems, in unrecorded wails that echoed in palace chambers. For them, the cult of bloodlines was not an abstraction. It was a personal horror. The death of their child was a calculated sacrifice demanded by power. Their milk dried not from nature but from decree. It is tempting to believe these acts belonged to barbarians or isolated rulers, but the evidence suggests otherwise. They were systemic, woven into the fabric of dynastic politics. Kings ordered it, queens tolerated it, ministers justified it, and courtiers looked away. The infant who drowned in a marble basin was not only a child of flesh, but a symbol of how ruthlessly power devoured innocence. Centuries later, the pattern remains clear. The obsession with purity, the fear of illegitimacy, and the paranoia of dynasties led to the systematic killing of infants across continents and cultures. Whether in a Byzantine palace, a Mughal harem, or a European monastery, the story was the same. Power demanded silence, and silence was imposed through water, through suffocation, through erasure. The cult of bloodlines taught monarchs that lineage was worth more than compassion, more than morality, more than life itself. In their quest to keep blood pure, rulers transformed nurseries into graves. The cries of the drowned are lost to history, but the cold record of their absence remains, and it leaves us with a truth more disturbing than any legend, that the greatest cruelty of medieval rule was not always waged on battlefields but in the cradle. The dynasties endured, thrones survived, but beneath their marble floors lay the ghosts of infants denied the right to exist. Their silence was the foundation upon which kingdoms built their myths of purity, proof that in the medieval world, power was measured not only in crowns and swords, but in the small bodies sacrificed to preserve them. In the medieval world, succession was fragile, and dynasties were built not on treaties or armies alone, but on the hidden struggles of women's bodies. The womb became a battlefield where politics, jealousy, and cruelty converged. A royal pregnancy could mean the rise of a new queen, the fall of a favored concubine, or the sudden execution of a woman whose child threatened to shift power. Each unborn life was weighed not in tenderness, but in its potential to alter the throne. In Byzantium, the imperial palace was a theater of silent wars between empresses and concubines. A legitimate birth could secure influence for generations, while the child of a rival threatened not only prestige but survival itself. Rumors tell of empresses ordering the forced termination of pregnancies within the palace, their authority ensuring silence. Midwives, bound by loyalty to power, sometimes suffocated infants the moment they emerged, declaring them stillborn. The cries of life were cut short, erased in service of political order. The Mughal harem in India carried the same peril. The zenana was filled with hundreds of women, each bound by the hope of bearing a son. But a child born to the wrong mother could unravel years of calculated succession planning. It was whispered that jealous rivals slipped poisons into food or into the milk meant for expectant mothers. Even the empress herself was not immune. Her womb too was watched, guarded, or sabotaged depending on the tides of courtly favor. For many women, pregnancy brought not joy but terror, as every flutter of life inside them was marked by suspicion from enemies hidden in silk and jewels. In the Ottoman court, survival often depended on eliminating rivals before they could even breathe. A sultan's harem was a prison of splendor, where women bore children under constant surveillance. If a favored concubine conceived, other women might seek to end her pregnancy in secrecy, using herbs and drugs known to cause miscarriage. These methods were as ruthless as the swords used on the battlefield. Behind closed curtains, dynastic wars claimed their first victims before the battles of succession even began. Europe, too, was not immune. Royal bastards born to mistresses were either legitimized when useful or erased when dangerous. Chronicles speak of queens ordering their rivals' pregnancies destroyed, fearing the arrival of a son who might someday be used as a pawn against their own heirs. In monasteries, infants born in secrecy were drowned in wells or left to die in cold cloisters, the church providing the silence required for royal honor to remain intact. The womb was monitored not by physicians but by priests and courtiers, who determined whether a child was a blessing or a threat. These acts were never officially recorded as murders. Instead, they were disguised under the language of ritual and necessity. A miscarriage could be natural, or it could be the result of deliberate intervention. An infant born lifeless could have been stillborn, or it could have been suffocated by the hands of a trusted midwife. The ambiguity protected the guilty and silenced the grieving. The cries of the mothers were smothered beneath the grandeur of dynastic continuity. For the women themselves, there was no true choice. Their bodies were instruments of statecraft, their pregnancies pawns in a larger game of survival. Some found themselves accused of adultery or witchcraft when a pregnancy threatened the wrong man's power. Others were forced to endure abortions carried out with primitive tools, risking infection and death. The very act of carrying life could lead to their execution, their swollen bellies seen as evidence of betrayal rather than motherhood. To understand this horror is to understand the logic of power in an age when blood determined the fate of empires. A child could secure alliances, claim thrones, or ignite wars. And so rulers treated pregnancies not as sacred but as dangerous gambles. Infants not yet born carried the weight of armies, lands, and crowns, and if the gamble proved too risky, those lives were ended in silence. By the end of this hidden war, countless children were erased before history could even record their names. Their absence echoes through dynastic records, sudden gaps, stillbirths, miscarriages that came too conveniently at moments of political strife. Each silence is a trace of cruelty, a reminder that the womb itself was turned into a weapon of control. In the chronicles of kings and emperors, these unborn children were never named. They were not remembered as sons or daughters, but as threats extinguished before they could breathe. The womb, meant to nurture life, became instead a graveyard of ambition, where dynasties preserved their power by drowning innocence before it ever entered the world. In the medieval imagination, a dynasty's bloodline was more fragile than any crown. It could be stained not only by defeat on the battlefield, but by the secret of an illegitimate birth, or the inconvenient arrival of a child whose existence threatened the delicate hierarchy of power. The life of a royal infant, especially one born in shadow, was often measured not in years but in moments. Those moments ended, time and again, in water. The drowning of infants was not a practice unique to one empire. Byzantine, Islamic, Indian, and Chinese sources all contain fragments of testimony, suggesting a shared cruelty in the name of lineage. It was often the midwife, standing between loyalty to her mistress and fear of the palace guards, who was forced to carry out the sentence. A basin of water, prepared under the guise of ritual purification, became a vessel of erasure, a child considered impure, born of an unapproved union, or at the wrong moment in succession, would be lowered into the water until its cries fell silent. The Byzantines, heirs to Roman power and Christian piety, nonetheless sanctioned such measures in their secretive palaces. Imperial chronicles written in cautious tones describe children born of shameful beds, whose presence could not be tolerated within the sacred walls of Constantinople. Legitimacy mattered more than innocence. To preserve the throne from dispute, emperors quietly erased the lives of infants who might someday become pawns for rivals. It was not a spectacle of public execution, but a quiet, hidden cruelty, carried out in private chambers, in the presence of only servants and mothers who dared not speak. In the Mughal courts of India, where harems were vast and political intrigue constant, such practices took on an almost ritual character. The emperor's harem was a battleground of women, each hoping to secure her child's survival. To give birth out of turn, or without the sanction of the emperor's affection, was to risk immediate loss. There are recorded cases of children drowned at birth, deemed dangerous to dynastic order. In these acts, cruelty was not random, it was calculated. Every infant born of a rival woman represented a fracture in the structure of succession, a future rebellion incubated in a cradle. Nor were Islamic courts exempt, despite the Quranic prohibition of infanticide. Chroniclers of the Abbasid Caliphate hint, in veiled words, of newborns disappeared when concubines fell from favor. The act was often shrouded in silence, justified as the protection of purity and the prevention of scandal. To name the deed openly would have been unthinkable, yet the pattern is clear. Unwanted infants were erased, and water was their unmarked grave. China's imperial courts reveal similar shadows. The Tang and later Ming dynasties, with their vast harems and rigid hierarchies, guarded the succession of the emperor with ruthless vigilance. Children born to lesser-ranked concubines, or those conceived in defiance of the empress's authority, were smothered or drowned before they could become political instruments. The silence of the archive speaks volumes. Official histories rarely mention these deaths, but private records, poems, and anecdotal chronicles preserve echoes of the practice. The court justified these drownings not as cruelty, but as necessary housekeeping of the dynasty. What made drowning so prevalent was its symbolism. Water was purification, a medium through which impurity could be washed away. To immerse an infant in water was to erase its existence without leaving visible scars. It was execution disguised as cleansing. In some courts, it was even cloaked in religious rationalization. The child was returned to the elements, dissolved into purity, its bloodline never staining the sacred line of succession. Yet behind this ritual lay unbearable human tragedy. The mothers, queens, concubines, or servants lived under an unspoken terror. To carry a child to term was no guarantee of joy. A basin of water stood waiting, and so too did the political calculations of men and women who valued purity over love. Many mothers were forced to remain silent, their grief hidden, their arms emptied by decree. The political utility of infant drowning was undeniable. It prevented rival claimants, erased embarrassing unions, and preserved the illusion of dynastic continuity. But its cost was humanity itself. Each life taken in silence was a reminder that power demanded blood, not only from warriors and rebels, but from the most defenseless of all. History remembers emperors, caliphs, and kings, It forgets the drowned. No monument bears their names. They exist only in whispers, in the guarded words of chroniclers who dared not speak plainly. Their brief existence was erased not only by water, but by the silence of official memory. To study these acts today is to confront the terrifying truth of dynastic politics, that the pursuit of purity demanded the sacrifice of innocence. The basins of water, hidden in palaces from Byzantium to Delhi, were not vessels of ritual. They were instruments of state, sanctioned cruelty, where life was extinguished for the illusion of order. And in that silence, in those drowned cries that history refused to record, lies one of the most haunting testaments to how far human power has gone to protect itself. The drowned infants of royal courts never lived long enough to carry names, yet they bore the full weight of empire. Their silence was not their choice, but the command of dynasties that valued purity above humanity. They remain history's most invisible victims, erased not only from succession, but from memory itself. In Byzantium, the preservation of dynastic purity was not an abstract concern. It was a doctrine enforced with cruelty and sanctioned by the silent approval of emperors and patriarchs alike. In the Byzantine mind, legitimacy was the foundation upon which empire rested. An emperor whose claim was questioned risked rebellion, exile, or assassination. Thus, the specter of illegitimate heirs, children born outside sanctioned unions or from rivals within the palace, became a danger not only to families, but to the survival of rulers themselves. Within the gilded palaces of Constantinople, the birth of a child was both a celebration and a moment of peril. If the infant could threaten the balance of succession, it was not uncommon for that life to end within hours. While chroniclers often veiled these acts in euphemism, references to infants who never saw the light of day or were taken by divine will are frequent in Byzantine sources. Such phrases concealed an unspoken truth. Many were deliberately drowned, suffocated, or simply starved, erased before they could become pawns in imperial intrigue. The act of drowning carried a particular weight. In Byzantine Christian culture, water symbolized both purification and death. To submerge an infant was not merely to extinguish a life, but to cleanse a dynasty of a perceived stain. Midwives, servants, and eunuchs were often the agents of this grim task. Ordered quietly by an empress or an emperor, they would place the newborn into a basin of water, holding it down until all movement ceased. It was a form of murder veiled in ritual, carried out not in anger, but with the cold detachment of political necessity. The fate of these children reflected the wider brutality of Byzantine succession. Few empires in history displayed such a relentless cycle of coups, depositions, and assassinations. An emperor could rarely trust even his own blood. Half-siblings, cousins, and bastard sons could rally discontented generals or factions of the Senate. In this climate, drowning an infant was considered not cruelty but prevention. To eliminate a child was to secure the throne against the chaos of rival claims. Evidence of such acts can be found scattered through Byzantine history. The reign of Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty, was shadowed by rumors of illegitimate births and suppressed heirs. The wives of emperors, fearful of rivals, sometimes took matters into their own hands. Empress Zoe, whose own reign in the 11th century was marked by poisonings and executions, presided over a court in which the silent removal of inconvenient infants was scarcely questioned. Even when official chronicles remained silent, the pattern of vanishing heirs speaks volumes. The practice was not confined to palaces alone. In noble households across the empire, families sought to protect their estates and inheritances by ensuring that illegitimate children would never grow to contest legitimate heirs. The drowning of infants thus extended beyond the imperial court, reflecting a broader culture of ruthless dynastic preservation. In Byzantine society, purity of blood was currency, and the disposal of children deemed impure was seen as both pragmatic and necessary. The psychological toll of such acts, though seldom recorded, must have been immense. Mothers who bore children outside favored unions were often powerless to prevent their deaths. Eunuchs, who formed much of the palace staff, became unwilling executioners, their loyalty tested against their conscience. Over time, these acts became normalized, swallowed into the rhythm of Byzantine politics. What should have been an unthinkable horror became routine. a quiet crime repeated generation after generation. It is important to note that Byzantine Christianity outwardly condemned infanticide. Yet, the needs of empire frequently overrode doctrine. The Church's silence on these cases reveals its complicity, or at least its inability to challenge imperial will. The drowning of an infant was never publicly acknowledged. It was masked as stillbirth, divine punishment, or a tragic accident. In this way, the empire preserved its moral faade, while beneath the surface, life was extinguished to protect crowns and dynasties. The cruelty of these acts reveals the fragility of Byzantine power. An empire that prided itself on law, theology, and ceremony still resorted to silencing the most vulnerable to preserve its image of order. Infants who might never have lived to challenge the throne were killed not for their deeds, but for what they symbolized: potential disruption, impurity, or scandal. Their cries, stifled beneath water or cloth, were swallowed by the silence of history. Byzantium's legacy is often remembered for its art, its theology, and its survival against enemies east and west. Yet within the palace walls, its rulers committed acts of calculated cruelty against their own flesh and blood. The drowning of illegitimate heirs stands as one of the most chilling reminders that in the Byzantine world, purity of lineage outweighed the sanctity of life itself. In the end, Byzantium's obsession with legitimacy left a hidden trail of infant corpses, their existence erased to protect an empire's fragile stability. The marble halls of Constantinople echoed with power and ceremony, yet beneath them lay a silence built on suffocated cries. History remembers the emperors, but it forgets the drowned, and that silence is its own indictment. In the centuries following the rise of Islam, the caliphates grew into vast empires, stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to the Indian subcontinent. At the heart of this empire stood the caliph, God's representative on earth, and the custodian of both political and spiritual authority. His legitimacy rested not only on the strength of armies, but on the sanctity of his bloodline. And it was here, within the hidden spaces of palace life, that the greatest cruelties were inflicted upon the most helpless. Islamic scripture was unequivocal in its stance. The practice of burying newborn daughters alive, once common in pre-Islamic Arabia, was condemned as barbaric, a crime against God and humanity. The Quran itself denounced those who would ask, with scorn, for what crime was she killed? Yet the moral clarity of the faith was not always mirrored in practice. Within the caliphal palaces, where succession disputes bred paranoia and ambition, children of royal blood could find themselves marked not for honor, but for erasure. The palace harem was both sanctuary and prison. It housed wives, concubines, and enslaved women whose fates were bound to the will of the ruler. From these women were born children who could carry claims to power, whether legitimate or illegitimate. In theory, the distinction mattered greatly. Islamic law sought to regulate inheritance and succession with precision. In reality, however, the court was a battlefield of rival consorts, eunuchs, and viziers. An infant born at the wrong moment to the wrong mother could become the catalyst for dangerous factional conflict. The solution, whispered but rarely recorded, was silence. Chroniclers, cautious in their wording, refer to children who disappeared. Infants born of concubines who lost favor, or of alliances suddenly deemed politically threatening, simply ceased to be mentioned in palace records. No coffins, no burials, no official mourning. Their brief lives were extinguished quietly, drowned in basins, smothered in cloth, or simply denied the nourishment needed to survive. The methods were rarely detailed, for such deeds could never be admitted openly. Instead, the silence itself spoke volumes. The Abbasid Caliphate, seated in Baghdad, was infamous for its palace intrigue. The harem, vast and intricately managed, was home to hundreds of women. With so many potential heirs, succession was never a straightforward matter. A caliph's death often unleashed bitter struggles among his sons, struggles that began long before the throne was vacant. Mothers schemed to elevate their children above rivals, while eunuchs enforced the will of the ruling elite. In this volatile environment, the line between survival and death for an infant could be frighteningly thin. Even in the supposedly devout courts of Cordoba under the Umayyads of Al-Andalus, stories emerged of infants born to slave concubines who were quietly removed. The official chronicles did not accuse the rulers directly. Instead, they used carefully chosen language. The child did not survive. The infant passed away. To the historian, the repetition of these phrases raises grim questions. Were these truly natural deaths, or the product of political calculation? The consistency of their occurrence suggests the latter. The practice was not uniform, nor was it universally tolerated. Many caliphs genuinely upheld Islamic injunctions against infanticide, taking pride in the survival and prosperity of their children. But the larger the empire grew, the more succession disputes multiplied, and with them, the temptation to ensure that inconvenient heirs never reached adulthood. Infanticide was not carried out as a public act, but as a private crime buried under layers of secrecy. What makes these hidden killings especially horrifying is the dissonance between doctrine and practice. Publicly, the caliph was the guardian of God's law, denouncing the barbarities of the pre-Islamic tribes. Privately, the court sometimes mirrored those very same horrors. The justification was always political necessity, to prevent rebellion, to protect the throne, to maintain stability. Yet stability was bought at the cost of innocent lives, extinguished in silence before they could speak their first word. For the mothers, the suffering was unspeakable. Some were powerless concubines, unable to protest the disappearance of their children. Others were rivals in the harem, complicit in another woman's grief if it secured their own child's survival. The emotional devastation was buried beneath protocol, leaving no trace in official documents. But in the fragments of poetry and whispered legends that survive, we hear the echoes of their mourning. Behind the grandeur of Baghdad, Damascus, or Cordoba, there were women who carried wounds invisible to history, wounds carved by the state's insistence on purity of lineage. In the end, the drowned and smothered infants of the caliphates became phantoms, never named, never recorded, never grieved in public memory. Their existence was scrubbed clean by official chroniclers, their erasure justified in the language of necessity. And yet, their absence lingers. Each missing line in the records, each abrupt silence where a name should have appeared, testifies to a hidden crime. They were born into palaces of marble and gold, yet their lives ended in silence and water. While the caliphates projected the light of faith and civilization across continents, their darkest secret lay in the erasure of their own blood. Infants drowned, forgotten, and denied even the dignity of remembrance. The imperial courts of China were places of unimaginable wealth, ritual, and order. But beneath the lacquered pillars and gilded roofs lay a system that turned the most natural act, the birth of a child, into a political weapon. In dynasties such as the Tang and Ming, the emperor's harem could hold hundreds of women, each ranked, monitored, and recorded in minute detail. Their primary role was to secure heirs, yet the birth of a son or daughter could never be celebrated too quickly. For in these courts, a baby's survival was determined less by fate than by palace politics. The empress, as the mother of the nation, was the supreme woman in the imperial hierarchy. Even though the emperor might have taken hundreds of concubines, no child could be considered legitimate without her sanction. Any birth that threatened her authority, especially from a rival favored by the emperor, was dangerous. Concubines who dared to produce children without proper authorization risked more than disgrace. They risked the silent erasure of their newborns. Chinese chronicles rarely describe such incidents openly, yet the patterns are visible. Records from the Tang dynasty recount whispers of infants who never lived past their first day, their existence unacknowledged in court annals. The Ming court was even more severe, with rigid hierarchies that treated a concubine's pregnancy as the empress's property, not the mother's. If a child was considered a threat, born out of sequence, born too soon, or born to a woman who had fallen out of favor, the order could be given quietly. The midwife's hands, or a bowl of water placed beside the birthing mat, completed the task. This practice was not framed as cruelty, but as necessity. The Confucian order demanded harmony and hierarchy, and no dynasty could risk a scandal of illegitimate succession. Infanticide in these cases was not shouted about, it was buried in silence, treated as the cleansing of disorder. For the women of the palace, silence was survival. They grieved in private, if they were allowed to grieve at all. The politics of birth extended far beyond the women's chambers. A single surviving child could change the trajectory of an empire. Empress Wu Zetian of the Tang dynasty, the only woman to rule China as emperor in her own right, understood the power of birth intimately. Her rise was shadowed by accusations that she had destroyed the children of rivals to ensure her dominance in the palace. Whether true or exaggerated by later historians, the accusations themselves reflect the cruel expectations of imperial women, that the elimination of another's child was a weapon as sharp as any sword. The Ming dynasty amplified these dangers. The court of the Forbidden City was a labyrinth of surveillance, ritual, and paranoia. Eunuchs oversaw every aspect of palace life, from the movements of concubines to the recording of their menstrual cycles. When a pregnancy was discovered, it was not a private matter. Officials reported it, ceremonies were arranged, and the empress or dowager empress decided the child's legitimacy. Yet even within this rigid structure, disappearances occurred. Some infants never made it to the registers. Some births were not announced at all. The whispers suggest that these children were smothered or drowned before their names could ever be inscribed, their brief existence erased from the historical record. This cruelty was born not only from jealousy or fear, but from the relentless pressure of dynastic survival. The Chinese throne was always vulnerable to usurpation. Factions formed around children of favored concubines, threatening the authority of the empress or dowager. In such an environment, every child was a potential pawn, or a potential rival to be extinguished. For the mothers, the horror was doubled. They were powerless to defend their own children, their lives entirely dependent on imperial favor. A concubine who gave birth at the wrong moment might be forced to watch as her baby was taken, drowned, or simply never acknowledged. She could not cry aloud, for even grief could be seen as defiance. The imperial annals are full of empresses praised for their virtue, yet behind those praises lay unspoken tragedies of women who lost everything and were forbidden even to mourn. The silence of history conceals many such stories, but fragments remain. A Ming-era court official wrote of infants born and not recorded, a careful phrase that spoke volumes without condemning the throne outright. Another described the palace as a place where life was weighed against the balance of order, and order always prevailed. These cryptic testimonies, couched in caution, suggest that the death of imperial infants was not rare but routine, hidden behind ritual and protocol. The cultural paradox is haunting. In Chinese tradition, ancestor veneration was sacred. Families cherished lineages and traced them across centuries. Yet in the palace, the heart of the dynasty itself, infants could be erased without trace, denied even the dignity of remembrance. For those children, there would be no ancestral tablets, no offerings, no prayers. They were swallowed by silence, victims of a system that demanded purity above compassion. The Forbidden City remains today, its halls echoing with centuries of power. Tourists walk through its gates, marveling at the grandeur of an empire. But within its shadows lie the untold cries of those who never lived long enough to be seen. The story of the forbidden births is not written in the grand histories of emperors and battles. It lingers instead in the silences, in the careful omissions of the chronicles, in the unmarked spaces where a child's name should have been inscribed. In the Forbidden City, even birth was not a promise of life. The infants who died in silence remind us that power demanded sacrifice, and that innocence itself was the first to be drowned. The Mughal Empire of India, at the height of its splendor, was a world of breathtaking palaces, jeweled thrones, and an imperial household that radiated majesty. Yet within the marble walls of the zenana, the secluded women's quarters, another reality unfolded, one far removed from the grandeur of public ceremonies. Here, the struggle for survival was relentless, not merely for women, but for the infants born into this labyrinth of suspicion and ambition. The zenana was both sanctuary and prison. Guarded by eunuchs and accessible only to the emperor and his chosen, it housed queens, concubines, princesses, and female relatives whose very lives were entangled in dynastic politics. In such an environment, the birth of a child was not a private matter of motherhood, but a political event of the highest consequence. Every infant carried the potential to disrupt the fragile balance of succession. Every cry of a newborn threatened to shift loyalties, inheritance, and the emperor's favor. It was in this suffocating world that darker practices took root. While Islamic law condemned infanticide, political necessity often outweighed religious morality. Chroniclers of the Mughal court, both Persian historians and European travelers, left traces of whispered accounts. Children born to secondary wives or concubines, seen as blemishes on the dynastic line, were quietly eliminated. The method, chilling in its intimacy, was the offering of poisoned milk. The practice carried symbolic weight. Milk, the universal emblem of nourishment and maternal love, was turned into an instrument of erasure. A midwife or trusted attendant, acting under quiet orders, would feed the infant milk laced with subtle toxins, arsenic, powdered seeds, or plant-based poisons available in the imperial apothecary. The act left few outward signs, and the child's death could be recorded as natural, one among the countless tragedies of infant mortality common to the era. In truth, these deaths were often deliberate silences imposed by politics. For the women of the Zenana, this horror was compounded by helplessness. A mother's body became the battlefield for dynastic legitimacy, yet her power to protect her newborn was often non-existent. If her child's birth displeased the empress, threatened the crown prince, or appeared to weaken the emperor's political alliances, she could do little to resist. To defy the will of the court was to risk her own life. Thus, many mothers watched in silence as their infants slipped away in their arms, knowing, yet unable to protest. The Mughal emperors themselves bore witness to the consequences of these practices. Akbar the Great, though remembered for his policies of tolerance and vision, oversaw a Zenana filled with rivalries. His successors, Jahangir Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, inherited not only the throne but also the poisonous culture of succession paranoia. Each feared the rise of illegitimate challengers or rival maternal lineages. The Zenana became a site where survival depended not on faith or affection, but on calculated allegiance and silence. The cruelty of poisoned milk was not limited to infants alone. Rumors persisted of its use in quiet assassinations of rivals, queens who fell from favor, and even princes whose ambitions threatened the emperor. Poisoning had long been part of the political repertoire of the subcontinent, but in the Zenana, its most haunting application was against the most defenseless of all, newborn children. The symbolism of these acts echoed beyond the palace walls. In a society that celebrated children as blessings and heirs as divine gifts, the calculated destruction of life revealed the contradictions of power. The empire that constructed the Taj Mahal, a monument to love and loss, also presided over the silent deaths of its own royal infants, erased before their lives could even begin. To outsiders, the Mughal Zenana appeared as a world of silk, jewels, and poetry. Court painters depicted idealized scenes of harmony, and official chroniclers rarely spoke of scandal, yet the silences in the record are as telling as the words. Behind every missing child in the chronicles, every unexplained absence in the genealogies, may have been a mother's grief and a court's calculated cruelty. These practices left scars not easily erased. Though the victims were infants too young to be remembered, their deaths altered the trajectories of dynasties. The line of succession in the Mughal court was never simple, always contested, often violent. Behind each legitimate heir lay the shadows of those deemed unworthy to live. The poisoned milk, the silenced cries, the whispered orders. These were as much instruments of empire as armies and treasuries. In the end, the Zenana of the Mughals was a theater of contradictions, a place of luxury and learning, where women commissioned poetry, art, and architecture, yet also a site of grief where motherhood itself was subjugated to the logic of empire. The infants who perished through poisoned milk left no monuments, no epitaphs, no names. They exist only as spectral traces in the margins of history, reminders of the price paid for dynastic purity. The Mughal Zenana remains a haunting paradox, a space where beauty and cruelty coexisted, and where the very substance of life, a mother's milk, was transformed into a weapon of death. In the silence of those jeweled chambers, the empire preserved its bloodline, but at the cost of innocence erased before it had even begun. In medieval Europe, lineage was both sacred and dangerous. The laws of inheritance dictated not only who would wear a crown, but who would control entire nations, armies, and the souls of millions. Yet behind the rigid structures of dynastic order lay a reality both fragile and brutal. Monarchs were men, queens were women, and affairs of the body rarely bowed to political necessity. From these liaisons came children, some celebrated, others condemned. They were the so-called royal bastards, born with the blood of kings yet denied the legitimacy of law. Some were acknowledged and even elevated. Figures such as William the Conqueror, born out of wedlock, proved that illegitimacy did not always bar greatness. Yet such examples were rare exceptions. For most, their existence was treated as a scandal, an embarrassment, or a threat to dynastic stability. And for those born at the wrong moment, to the wrong mother, or in the shadow of fragile succession, their fate was darker still. Accounts from across Europe reveal a chilling pattern. Some royal bastards were quietly absorbed into the lower ranks of nobility, given minor estates or ecclesiastical positions, useful yet harmless. But many others, particularly infants, were not granted even the chance to live. Chronicles whisper of babies spirited away from royal chambers in the dead of night, carried not to cradles but to wells, rivers, or cloisters where sympathetic monks would baptize and bury them on the same night. Their cries ended beneath the cover of sanctity, extinguished in the name of dynastic survival. The practice was not codified in law, nor was it openly admitted. Infanticide was universally condemned by the Church, yet the very institutions meant to defend innocence were often complicit in its erasure. Noble families relied upon monastic houses to conceal inconvenient births. A newborn delivered in secrecy could be presented for baptism, a fleeting moment of recognition before being submerged and silenced forever. In the records, these deaths were attributed to illness, frailty, or God's will. Rarely was the truth written plainly. The fear of illegitimate heirs was not imagined. Inheritance disputes could topple thrones. Rival claimants often rallied armies around so-called bastards, leveraging their bloodline as a banner for rebellion. This was not theoretical. History is filled with examples. The Wars of the Roses in England, the Capetian disputes in France, and countless baronial uprisings on the continent exploited the existence of half-blooded children. For every acknowledged bastard who lived, dozens more were extinguished in infancy to prevent such challenges. Mothers, too, were caught in this machinery of cruelty. Queens who failed to produce male heirs often saw their rivals' children as existential threats. Mistresses who bore royal offspring risked not only disgrace, but the death of their child. In courts where alliances shifted like sand, the survival of an infant could determine whether a woman rose in influence or was cast aside in ruin. For many, drowning was less a crime than an act of political hygiene. Yet even as these acts were cloaked in silence, they lingered in rumor and legend. Chroniclers recorded whispers of infants lowered into wells, their tiny bodies hidden beneath castle stones. Ballads sung in villages spoke of royal children cast into rivers, their deaths reinterpreted as cautionary tales. In monasteries, shadows lingered over baptismal fonts said to have been used not to sanctify life, but to drown it. These stories, while veiled in ambiguity, carried the weight of cultural memory, reminders of a truth too terrible to be openly confessed. The psychological toll of these hidden acts cannot be measured. Behind every drowned infant stood a father who ordered it, a mother who mourned it, and attendants who carried out the deed with trembling hands. Silence was demanded, but silence was never innocent. Servants whispered, courtiers suspected, and generations passed down fragments of what had been buried. What emerges is a portrait of power so absolute that even the sanctity of life bent before it. By the late medieval period, the rise of more formalized dynastic laws, combined with increasing church authority, made such practices harder to conceal. Yet the shadow remained. The whispered drownings of royal bastards were not mere tales of cruelty, but symptoms of a deeper sickness, a world in which the obsession with pure succession demanded the destruction of its own children. In Europe's castles, the rivers and wells held secrets too heavy for the chronicles to bear. These children, born of kings yet denied the right to live, remind us that dynastic power was preserved not only by armies and treaties, but by silence, and by the deliberate drowning of innocence. In the chronicles of medieval and ancient courts, there is a recurring pattern: the quiet disappearance of infants who had been born under the wrong sign, to the wrong mother, or in the wrong order. These children, born of emperors, kings, or sultans, were paradoxically both the most privileged of all infants and the most vulnerable. They were symbols of potential power, but their very existence could destabilize dynasties. And so, throughout the centuries, the basin of water, the simplest of instruments, became a vessel of erasure. To later historians, drowning a newborn might seem like an act of desperation, a crime of passion. But in the eyes of medieval courts, it was something more structured, a ritual of cleansing. Water, in nearly every ancient religion, bore a symbolic weight. It purified, renewed, erased sins, and offered rebirth. For the midwives and attendants who carried out these deeds, plunging an infant into water was sometimes framed as an act of necessity, a grim washing away of impurity rather than an unambiguous act of murder. The justifications were almost always religious. In Byzantium, where legitimacy was guarded with ruthless vigilance, church language was bent to political will. An illegitimate child, especially one born to a concubine, was branded a threat to divine order itself. The water in which the child drowned was said to cleanse the empire of shame. To admit the true motive, that rival factions feared future claims to the throne, would be to confess weakness. Instead, ritual silence covered the crime. In the courts of China, a similar pattern emerged. Imperial genealogies recorded the births of favored children with careful precision, yet some names vanished between the lines, erased by order of the empress or dowager. Infants born to lesser, ranked concubines were smothered or drowned not simply out of cruelty, but out of ritualized necessity. The act was explained as restoring harmony within the palace, preventing chaos in the hierarchy of heirs. By drowning the child, the dynasty was believed to cleanse itself of potential disorder. Even in parts of medieval Europe, where Christianity strictly condemned infanticide, whispered accounts describe infants lowered into wells or hidden in monastic rivers. Religious justification masked political cruelty. It was not infanticide, but the removal of a soul from worldly sin. Yet the patterns are too consistent to dismiss. Bastards born from royal indiscretions were most often lost within days of birth. Records describe them as weak, sickly, or stillborn, but suspicions of drowning or suffocation persist in the shadows of chronicles. These rituals were not simply about the child, they were about the mother. Women in royal courts bore the crushing weight of dynastic survival. A queen who failed to produce a legitimate male heir might watch as her rivals bore children who could threaten her own standing. To preserve her dominance, midwives loyal to her could be ordered to end the rival's newborn life at the moment of birth. What was publicly presented as God's judgment was privately a weapon of female rivalry, sharpened by jealousy and fear. The drowned infant was a silent casualty of palace politics. Silence was the final and most essential element. No proclamations were made. No tombs were built. These infants were erased not just physically, but historically. Their existence was often reduced to rumors, to marginal notes in chronicles, or to accusations hurled in later political conflicts. This silence was deliberate. A public execution sent a message. An unspoken drowning erased a threat before it could even exist. The emotional cost, however, cannot be overlooked. Behind the ritual was human tragedy. Mothers who had carried these children often mourned in secrecy. Chronicles rarely mention their grief, but fragments survive, in private poems, in whispered tales, in oral traditions. These women lived with the knowledge that the very courts, demanding their loyalty, had sanctioned the deaths of their children. The silence demanded of them was as cruel as the drowning itself. The ritual of drowning revealed the core paradox of dynastic survival. Rulers claimed divine sanction for their bloodlines, yet they polluted that same sacred lineage with acts of deliberate murder. They dressed the killing of infants in robes of religion, turning an act of raw political fear into a ritual of cleansing. The water became both tomb and veil, concealing crimes beneath the language of purity, and yet the silence did not last forever. Centuries later, fragments in chronicles, scattered rumors, and inconsistencies in royal genealogies expose the truth. The drowned infants are gone, but the patterns of their erasure remain. They reveal that dynastic purity, was never pure at all. It was built upon ritualized cruelty, jealousy, and the systematic silencing of the most vulnerable of all lives. In the basins of water where infants were drowned, dynasties saw only purification. What history reveals, however, is something far more haunting, that the quest for power demanded not just the blood of enemies, but the quiet erasure of their own children. What was once ritual cleansing now lingers as ritual silence, a silence that history itself can no longer fully keep. In the grand palaces of medieval courts, power was measured not only in armies, gold, or alliances, but in the fragile cries of newborn children. To birth a child of royal blood was both a blessing and a curse. For some women, it meant security, status, and influence. For others, it meant despair, for the very life they had carried for 9 months could be deemed dangerous, illegitimate, or unworthy. And in those moments, their child would be taken from them, often drowned in basins of water or suffocated in silence, their tiny existence erased before the world could ever know their name. For every drowned royal infant, there was a mother left behind. Her pain was not recorded in official annals, for grief was considered weakness, and weakness had no place in dynastic politics. Yet across empires, faint echoes of that grief can be found in whispered accounts, in poetry hidden between the lines, and in legends told far from the gaze of kings. These mothers carried the weight of a cruelty few could imagine, the unbearable knowledge that their child's death was not the will of disease or fate, but of calculated political decision. In Byzantium, the imperial court was notorious for erasing inconvenient heirs. Chroniclers noted infants who did not survive the night, though the truth lay in the hands of midwives, commanded to act as executioners. Behind every terse phrase in the chronicles was a woman whose arms were left empty, whose milk flowed though her baby's lips would never nurse. Such grief, in its silence, became corrosive. It did not belong to history's public stage, but it gnawed at the private lives of those women, destroying them in ways no blade or poison ever could. In the Mughal zananas of India, the walls were adorned with jewels and perfumed with incense, but they also held secrets soaked in sorrow. Contemporary travelers wrote of concubines whose infants vanished mysteriously after birth. It was said that milk was laced with poison, or newborns drowned discreetly to prevent challenges to the emperor's favored lineage. For the women who had carried those children, no comfort was offered. They were expected to endure with quiet submission, as though their bodies were vessels to be used and emptied at will. Their mourning was confined to whispers in the night. Their tears should only into their pillows. In medieval China, beneath the grandeur of the Forbidden City, imperial concubines bore the constant fear that their children might not be allowed to live. The empress, as mother of the empire, often had the authority to decide the fate of infants born to rivals. Records from the Tang and Ming courts describe children who died soon after birth, though suspicion lingered that many deaths were deliberate. For the mothers, there was no justice, no acknowledgement of the life extinguished. Their sorrow was absorbed into the machinery of empire, their cries muffled by ritual and hierarchy. Even in medieval Europe, where Christianity condemned infanticide, royal bastards born of scandalous affairs or inconvenient unions often disappeared. Some were sent to monasteries, where their survival depended on the mercy of monks. Others, it was whispered, were drowned in wells or rivers, their existence denied by those who feared scandal more than they feared God. And for the women, queens, mistresses, or servants alike, there was nothing but the memory of a child they were forbidden to grieve. Their mourning was seen as rebellion, their love as a liability. What lingers in the rare surviving records is not only the fact of these deaths, but the enduring ache of maternal loss. A Persian poem speaks of a mother whose infant was washed away by hands not my own, a haunting metaphor for drowning. A Byzantine lament, preserved in fragments, speaks of milk turning to poison in the breast of the forsaken. These scraps of history remind us that the greatest silence was not in the deaths themselves, but in the erasure of women's voices from the official record. For these women, grief was doubly cruel. They mourned the loss of a child, a grief that by itself can destroy the human spirit. But they also endured the knowledge that their children were not taken by fate, but by human decision, sanctioned by courts and rulers. This made their suffering unspeakable. To cry too loudly was to invite suspicion. To resist was to invite death. Thus they bore their pain in silence, becoming walking tombs of memory, their hearts carved with invisible epitaphs. The practice of drowning royal infants was framed as a defense of dynastic purity, a protection of power from corruption or scandal. But its true legacy is found in the mothers who remembered. They carried the memory of tiny hands, silenced cries, and breaths cut short not by nature but by decree. Their mourning was not written in official histories, but it persisted in private sorrow, in folklore, and in the whispered legends of palace servants who dared to pity them. History remembers kings, emperors, and dynasties. It seldom remembers the women whose wombs bore the heirs of empires, only to see them drowned in the pursuit of purity. Yet behind every erased infant lies the shadow of a mother who remembered, who carried grief like a secret wound. Their silence is the most haunting legacy of all, for silence is where cruelty hides and where history's darkest truths are buried. The drowned infants never lived to claim their heritage, but their mothers carried the weight of their absence until death. In the corridors of power, their cries were dismissed as whispers. Yet centuries later, those whispers remain, reminders that dynasties were built not only on ambition and blood, but on the silenced grief of women who remembered what others tried to erase. The medieval obsession with bloodlines was both a political weapon and a cultural prison. Rulers across continents claimed divine sanction to lead, insisting their blood alone carried legitimacy. To preserve this illusion of purity, dynasties carried out acts that now read as unthinkable. Infants, born at the wrong time, to the wrong mother, or with the wrong claim, were quietly erased. The practice was not accidental nor isolated. It was ritualized, repeated, and justified by the very structures of power that proclaimed themselves sacred. In Byzantium, the continuity of the imperial line mattered more than the humanity of its members. Chroniclers recorded the whispered fates of newborns who emerged from the bodies of concubines without the blessing of the empress. These children were never swaddled in royal silk. Instead, they were suffocated in silence, or drowned in basins of water, their short cries extinguished beneath the same element that symbolized baptism and purity. The contradiction was deliberate water cleansed impurity, but here it cleansed the dynasty of what was deemed contamination. The Islamic caliphates publicly forbade infanticide, condemning it as a relic of pre-Islamic ignorance. Yet within the palaces, whispers told of another reality. Concubines who lost favor, who bore children at the wrong political moment, often found their infants missing by dawn. Chroniclers spoke cautiously, framing disappearances in vague terms, but the pattern was unmistakable. The justification remained the same. A bloodline must not be diluted, a dynasty must not be compromised. In this way, morality bent beneath the weight of political necessity. In the courts of China, particularly during the Tang and Ming dynasties, similar stories surface. The emperor's harem was a labyrinth of competing mothers. The empress wielded power not only through ceremony, but through control of life and death. If a concubine bore a son without her sanction, the baby's survival was in question. Smothered beneath cloth, drowned in buckets of water, or simply left to die, these children were erased before their existence could threaten the balance of power. The court chroniclers, loyal to the throne, rarely named the dead. Silence was itself a tool of cruelty. Mughal India added another layer of horror. Here, poison was often the method of choice. Milk laced with lethal substances was pressed to the lips of newborns, who never lived long enough to be counted in official registers. The act was hidden behind jewels, silks, and palatial grandeur, but its brutality was unmistakable. Behind each quiet death stood calculations of inheritance, alliances, and imperial image. The infant was not seen as a child, but as a liability, a blemish to be erased. In Europe, the treatment of royal bastards varied, but the danger was consistent. Some were legitimized and made useful, while others were cast aside. Rumors swirled of babies drowned in castle wells or silenced in monasteries. Even the church, which claimed to defend the sanctity of life, often served the interests of rulers, turning a blind eye when the protection of dynasty demanded blood. In the chronicles of medieval Europe, the silence surrounding missing children is often louder than the records of their lives. This obsession with purity was rooted in fear. Dynasties feared division, rival claims, and the collapse of authority. They cloaked their cruelty in language of preservation, claiming to defend stability, faith, or divine will. But beneath this rhetoric lay something simpler and darker, the willingness to destroy the innocent to preserve power. Infants became political enemies. Their lives weighed against the ambitions of adults. The mothers carried the unspoken grief. Some were silenced by the threat of execution, others by the knowledge that protest meant death for themselves as well. Their sorrow, rarely recorded in official history, surfaces only in fragments, in poems, in laments, in whispered legends passed down through generations. These traces reveal the human cost hidden beneath the grandeur of royal courts. The infants were drowned in water, but their mothers were drowned in silence. What remains most haunting is the normalization of these acts. Drowning or smothering a child was not seen as cruelty but as necessity. To kill was to cleanse, to erase impurity, to guard the illusion of a perfect bloodline. Ritual merged with politics, creating a logic where horror became duty. By stripping infants of their humanity, dynasties convinced themselves they were preserving something greater. Yet history strips away the justifications. With distance, the cruelty is laid bare. The myth of purity was nothing more than an excuse for calculated murder. The reality was that dynasties were built on the corpses of their own children, extinguished before they could even speak their names. The pursuit of unbroken lineage left nothing unbroken but the most fragile of lives. In the end, the myth of purity concealed only cruelty. The drowned infants of royal courts left no monuments, no graves, no legacies. They survived only as shadows in the chronicles, silent victims of dynasties that believed their blood was worth more than life itself. The past does not remain buried. Its echoes resurface in the most fragile ways, through rumors passed across generations, through records written in veiled language, and through the silence of missing heirs. As historians sifted through the archives of medieval courts, they uncovered not only the chronicles of conquest and triumph, but the faint, horrifying traces of deliberate erasure. Behind the facade of dynastic power was a ritual of cruelty so deeply woven into royal life that it became invisible. The drowning of royal infants born at the wrong time, to the wrong mother, or under the shadow of scandal. In the annals of Byzantium, references emerge of heirs who did not thrive. The phrase concealed the grim reality of infants smothered or drowned, their existence blotted from the record to protect the legitimacy of the reigning line. The empire's survival depended not on tolerance, but on absolute purity of succession. An illegitimate child, even if the emperor's own flesh, was not merely unwanted but dangerous. His or her survival could spark uprisings, encourage rival claimants, or fracture fragile alliances. Thus, silence was imposed not only on the child but on history itself. This same silence appears across cultures. In imperial China, the Tang and later the Ming courts produced countless offspring through emperors' vast harems. But not all of these infants were celebrated. When births occurred outside the careful hierarchy dictated by the empress, the children often vanished. Midwives and attendants, bound by loyalty or fear, carried out the unspoken orders. Records list hundreds of births, but patterns of missing entries raise chilling questions. Each absence may conceal a basin of water, a hurried drowning, and a lifetime of grief locked within the palace walls. The Islamic caliphates, despite clear prohibitions in religious law, were not immune to similar erasures. Chroniclers of the Abbasid court noted sudden disappearances of children born to concubines who fell from favor. Official documents avoided open mention, but poetry of the era occasionally alluded to grieving mothers and silenced infants, suggesting a practice that contradicted doctrine but served dynastic paranoia. It was a cruelty carried out in whispers, where the stain of illegitimacy outweighed the sanctity of life. Europe, too, bears the scars of this hidden violence. While some illegitimate heirs were legitimized for political use, many more disappeared. Monastic chronicles contain vague references to infants placed in cloisters and not surviving, while oral traditions speak of newborns consigned to rivers or castle wells. The obsession with lineage and the terror of scandal transformed the most vulnerable into expendable casualties of power. For every celebrated royal baptism, there may have been an unmarked drowning, unrecorded and unmourned beyond the mother's silent tears. What unites these fragments is the recurring theme of ritualized concealment. Water, the symbol of purification in many traditions, became the medium of erasure. To immerse the infant was to cleanse the dynasty of impurity, to wash away the shame of unwanted birth. This was not random brutality but systemic cruelty, reinforced by cultural justifications and the rigid structures of political succession. In every basin of water lay the belief that a dynasty could remain unsullied, even if it meant silencing its own blood. The mothers, however, left traces of resistance. Poems written by women in imperial China speak of the cries that never grew, lines so veiled they passed unnoticed by censors but survive as testimony of grief. In Byzantium, rumors lingered of empresses who secretly mourned lost infants while outwardly defending the purity of the throne. Across continents, the agony of women, who carried life only to see it extinguished by decree, survives not in official accounts, but in scattered fragments of personal lamentation. Centuries later, when historians encounter these absences, they face not only the horror of lost children, but the calculated silence of history itself. The cruelty was deliberate, yet its memory was buried. It is in this absence that the horror becomes most profound, the recognition that entire generations of infants were denied even the dignity of remembrance. Dynasties glorified their continuity, yet that continuity was purchased with the lives of those who could not be acknowledged. To study these fragments is to confront a grim truth, that power has always demanded sacrifice, and that in the courts of emperors and kings, the first victims were often their own children. The drowned infants remain nameless, faceless, and voiceless, their existence erased, but their absence impossible to ignore. They are the shadows behind the grandeur of royal portraits, the silences in genealogical charts, and the haunting reminder that history's triumphs are inseparable from its cruelties. The cries of those infants were stifled centuries ago, yet their absence still echoes in the records of kings and empires. It is a silence heavier than sound, a silence that speaks of dynasties preserved through sacrifice, and of innocence deliberately erased in the name of power.